the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, we do want to mention just briefly that we have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. You'll gain access to our Discord server. Taylor is running some reading groups. We've been recording those sessions and making those available to patrons as well. So if you're enjoying the show and you want some more content, that's a great way to participate in some of those larger discussions and have access to, some more content. So anyways, today we're going to be having a look at Freud's Project for a Scientific Psychology. One of the primary reasons why I wanted to discuss this text or look at this text is that I actually saw a tweet. Someone did tweet. I can't remember what the tweet was, but it referenced Freud positing like these three types of neurons or neuronae or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, neurones. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. So,
and their relationship to the three syntheses of the unconscious in the work of Deleuze and Guattari. And I think there's also, even perhaps, going back to, there's some ties there to obviously Kant's three critiques and so forth as well that we may or may not get to.
There's a lot of triads. If you start to do it, we might as well get to the bastardized, vulgarized Hegelian synthesis,
right.
Antithesis,
thesis. Fichte.
The young Fichtean triad. No, I guess, there's, I will definitely, we can try to make some connections, but go ahead.
I didn't have much else to start us off with there. I just wanted to kind of give some background to kind of why we even wanted to look at this piece, which was not published during Freud's lifetime. And I think maybe even to just mention, I think a lot of people don't realize that Freud was he went to medical school,
Yeah,
he did. He wasn't like a humanities major or something like that, just making shit up off the top of his head. He did have an exposure to at least the kind of, I don't know, probably like the more prestigious educational opportunities that were available during the late, 19th century. So I don't know, just to say that Freud often gets dismissed as a charlatan, but I don't think that's necessarily fair in every respect,
Yeah, he got his medical degree in 1881. So this is 1895. I think he's born in the 1850s. What is it, 56? Hold on, what's his birth? Yeah, 1856. Oh, he's got a birthday coming up in about a week and a half. Happy early birthday, Dr. Freud. Anyway, yeah, so in 85, he would have gotten his habilitation, which basically like his PhD, right? In neuropathology. So, and then it's after that he's actually doing some translations of French, from French to German, of different authors, and some of this I think in this volume 1 that we're working through, because this is all volume 1 of the the Strachey Standard Edition. I believe in this volume some of those prefaces, translator forwards he's written. But he's also, going to France, studying. This is where he learns again. Before he discards it as a method, he's learning the art of hypnosis and the art of suggestion, two interrelated types of therapeutic approaches that he believes could be the way to help people deal with their problems, right? Um, but he doesn't hold on to that for very long. He turns against them basically for both for more or less the same reason, right? And he will kind of restate this throughout, even though he won't keep bringing up hypnosis and suggestion, except in the early work. But for the most part, um, just to have stated the repressed material, just to have them formulate it, whether in hypnotic state or trying to get them to recall that hypnotic state, or to suggest, right? It's almost in a certain way the way that he rejects suggestion, and like the way that you ask these leading questions to get them to like almost confess their inner guilt and shame. It's very much his rejection of it reminds me of the way in which like experienced interrogators have rejected certain police methods in leading, whether it be obviously in court you call it leading the witness, but in terms of like trying to extract a confession, you sort of give evidence to the interrogee and you break them down and sort of give them the means to get to where you want them to go. Freud sees that as obviously not a viable path. But out of this interest is obviously it's breaking with hypnosis as a method and suggestion as a method that psychoanalysis has to find a third path, right? And I think in 95, and I'm sure he'd been thinking about this all throughout for long. I mean, even the editor's note kind of works out how in 94 or even earlier letters, whether it be to Fleece or whoever, he's sort of throwing out these ideas and wanting to explain. But I think that, as I told you before we started recording, Coop, and I'll pause here afterwards, is that he's trying to use his medical knowledge and his knowledge in neuropathology to form a neurological groundwork and framework for what psychoanalysis will eventually become. So a hard science, if you will, an emergent, quote unquote, hard science to ground the clinical.
Right. Yeah. I think it's interesting. I mean, the general starting point is this attempt to, like you said, kind of trace these neurological psychical processes back to I said a sort of materiality relative to flows of energy through the body and the psyche, which at the end of the day probably all do involve. I'm obviously not a neurologist or anything like that, but certainly there's some type of I think we can at least posit that there's a type of electrical current or energy flow process. Like, we can probably certainly stake somewhat of our reputations on that general thesis, right? And so Freud kind of looks to build on that general idea by positing this notion of Q, which would represent that sort of quantifiable force of excitation and whatnot that is subject to the laws of physics and motion and whatnot.
Yeah, we could talk about a few of these acronyms or abbreviations that he has. One is Q, which stands for Quantität, right? In German. I'm not going to try to reproduce all of his German, but Q is just the simple thing of, I mean, because you're right. There's a certain, whether we call it a materialism or not, we can leave aside. Obviously, he's trying to find a way of we could more likely link it to a kind of positivist empiricist type of approach.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah,
Because
that's probably a better way to characterize it. Yeah.
obviously we can't point to a Q, although at the time and anatomically, this again on the cutting edge, if you will, more or less around this time, axons, dendrites, right, the breaking down of neurons, the birth of neurology is, in this the stuff, the terminology that we still use is around this time. And so he is kind of to a certain extent on an exploratory dive. Yes, this is a speculative paper, but it's grounded in empirical research. And so in that sense, even though he's, even though it was just being able to be able to like actually quote unquote see some of the stuff he's talking about in axons and dendrites and the way that neurons work together, he more or less is in the ballpark, right? Given certain parameters. And so, yes, Q will be, for the most part, the way I understand it is quantity, and it stands for quantity coming from external reality, right? And this is obviously a dualism that we find in Freud all the time, where with fight or flight stimuli, right, with stimuli coming from the outside world, if there's, let's say, pain or a source of stimulus that's intense, the organism can run away, right, can flee. At the very least, one of the things it can do from Q. But what he calls, what I've pronounced queta, which is Q followed by the Greek short vowel eta, that's why I call it queta or queta. That's what he wants to think of endogenous internal stimuli, right? And we know that the source of that for Freud later, he will very much mobilize the language of Trieb, of drives, or as Strachey calls them, instincts. And there's no flight from that. So already, even though he only, I think, maybe uses the word Trieb, I think I saw in at least one or two pages he mentions Trieb. It's still that's not really his focus, but the language is there. And he is thinking about this difference between external excitation, internal endogenous stimuli from what will be called Trieb. And I do think that that's those two, Q and Q eta or queta, is a recurring acronym throughout, because he's interested not just, as you mentioned, in and our body's relation to reality and even what will be called reality testing, right? But in this internal life, because that's kind of what psychoanalysis is predicated upon. If there's a binary there, yes, it's going to give more precedence to queta, to the internal life sometimes, but at the same time, obviously, because he's developing a neurological theory that is trying to ground memory, both are going to be important. You're going to need the external excitations along with an internal functioning, right?
And I assume that's kind of directly tied to the ideas of the primary process, secondary process.
Yes.
Right? Or at least to some degree, right? Which would sort of be like, I don't know if this would be right. Maybe this is cheating or like, but it feels so. There's like the involuntary aspects of the nervous system, heartbeat, breath, etc. Right? Would those kind of be, I don't know, not an analog, but it feels like that goes towards the primary process.
I think analogically, you're right. On the level of body, on the level of like, even you're talking about like the brain, the reptilian brainstem is doing all of these, Freud might call that preconscious rather than unconscious, just following at least the way that he will sediment his language, because we could obviously become conscious of our breathing and actually like, right. But obviously when we're asleep, when the ego is asleep, as he might say, yet we still breathe. So there's an interesting way in which, if we follow his definition that the secondary processes of consciousness are regulated by the ego, then yeah, to a certain extent, some of the bodily functions might overlap with unconscious. But I think that we do want to perhaps reserve unconscious for, as you said, that's why it's an analogy, right? We do want to think about unconscious processes as a part of the psychical apparatus, and not necessarily tied to, like, the fact that our brain keeps us breathing even though we're not thinking about it, right?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking more so along the lines, because he does discuss primary process kind of being like the basically energy or information is flowing unfiltered,
Uninhibited, yes.
uninhibited, right? So that feels like, I don't know, to me it suggested this connection to those kind of automated processes of the body,
Right.
that are, because they're obviously not, I mean, like, good idea. I mean, very salient point to bring to mind, that both heartbeat and
Right.
breath and so forth can be used to modulate to some degree, which is maybe an interesting. That's really interesting. Actually, I hadn't really considered that.
Yeah, I would say that I know that with the primary and secondary processes, the language that he'll use later, and even though he plays with it a little bit in here, it hasn't become, again, like, conceptualized. But the language he'll bring in to sediment the difference would be between the binding or bound energy, the binding of energy, or bound energy, which would be secondary, right, and then unbound energy, which I think that for Freud, one of the things that the cycle apparatus does, and as you have in your notes, the neurones have a tendency to divest themselves of the energy that flows through them, right? Just as the cycle apparatus, as we've talked about numerous times, for Freud, one of its goals is to keep energy, or keep pressure, tension, keep the
Intensity,
draw,
we might even say.
intensity, to keep it at either a sort of steady equilibrium, a minimum, or even zero, right? Depending on, and he will. But one of the things that, at least unless we go to, like, almost what he'll call the nirvana principle of absolute divestiture of energy,
Which would
for
be
the
like a
most part,
body without organs.
I mean,
Just to throw a
the taut, slippery surface that wards off the flows. Yeah, I mean, at the limit, yeah, the full body without organs, right? Throwing off the machines in the paranoid mode. But yes, I think that one of the things that, the way I believe he calls it, there's a tendency for neurones to keep the energy constant. And one of the ways it does this is by binding energy, which allows it to be rendered, if not useful to the psychical apparatus, then then at the very least not harmful. I think what Freud is worried about is unbound energy, which, again, if we use an analogy, we can almost imagine, like, the neutrinos from, like, radioactive elements cutting through, bombarding and destroying on an atomic level. There's almost something similar with unbound energy, where Freud's trying to think about different processes of defense, including the ego, which he already brings up in this essay, but he will continue thinking later. And it's the failure to bind energies that will, for Freud, be a part of his theorization. We even saw this in, like, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, right? When he's thinking, how is it, if dreams are always wish fulfillments, how is it that these soldiers coming back from the war are continually dreaming about being on the battlefield, which would obviously, these nightmares, these PTSD episodes. And for Freud, it in fact is about, as we've talked about, it's about building the anxiety necessarily required in order to have a certain mastery over a situation for which they weren't prepared, right? It's almost like the wish was to have been prepared to abound the unexpected encounters of these traumatic battlefield situations. Whether or not we believe that and think maybe Freud's cheating a little bit with that, I don't know. I do think that it is interesting that he at least says, doesn't this make me have to get rid of my wish fulfillment theory? Which he, again, in this essay points to, right? Already he's thinking about dreams as wish fulfillment. And so anxiety for him later, especially related to these nightmares, these war dreams, these anxiety dreams, are about preparing the means to bind, if that makes sense.
Do you, I mean, this is kind of gestured towards maybe not, well, maybe not even that, that might be too timid of a term, but he kind of talks about how the ego binds. So am I understanding correctly that he's talking about how the ego is binding these to symbols? Right. So like, whether it be this, what is the mnemic images?
The mnemic, yeah.
Mnemic,
yeah. The memory is playing a role there, right? And I think symbol formation is one of the ways. He himself talks about how strong symbols are in life, doesn't he? Let me see if I can control F for this, where he talks about the soldier dying for a piece of cloth.
Right.
He's a bit. A soldier will here we go. This is page 349 from the Standard Edition, Volume 1. The formation of symbols also takes place normally. A soldier will sacrifice himself for a many-colored scrap of stuff on a pole. Nice, Ricky. Because it has become the symbol of his fatherland, and no one thinks that's neurotic. So that's kind of interesting, where he's distinguishing hysterical formation of ideational symbolic formations, which are, again, crudely speaking, illogical, versus what conventionally we see as very logical. It's, was it Horace who said, "Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori," right? It's rightful and it's sweet and good to die for your country, right? Like, that's a kind of thing that we take for granted that is quote unquote normal, even though Freud himself, the way that he's phrasing it, is kind of like he will in his theory of sexuality, kind of be like, well, you think normal sexuality has no perversions, but let me, I hate to break it to you. He almost seems to be gesturing that, in fact, this kind of symbol formation is pathological. We consider it normal. And I'm sorry, I may have lost your question though. I mean, you were saying about, were you suggesting symbol formation is a way of binding, or is it just the ideational networks?
Well, I guess I was trying to work through like what exactly the connection would be to the images or even symbols or what have you, and something like the signifier in Lacan. If maybe this is kind of something that Lacan is drawing on relative to his whole project as far as the signifier is concerned. The symbolic order, the imaginary, etc.
Right.
And and maybe perhaps even something back to like Jung or something in the archetypes, right?
Yeah, it's interesting that for Freud, the hysteric is one who substitutes the symbol for the thing. It's precisely because the thing is almost too charged with energy that the psychical apparatus or the facilitations of the neurones, as Freud might say in this period, have to branch off and cut off the connections, the ideational network. The rhizome has to be severed, if you will, in the psychical apparatus in order to keep the thing from the ideational chain of reasoning, precisely because it's too charged. It's overcharged. It's explosive, and I think that for Freud, part of psychoanalysis, as we'll see later in his work, is about reconstructing the ideational chain, that whose gaps are literally constitutive of symptoms and symptom formation, right? Specifically, in specific types of hysteria, which he calls conversion hysteria, which is kind of interesting because we started off by talking about the mind body complex, maybe not necessarily in a Cartesian way, but still, um, he sees in conversion hysteria, what is converted is the mental representative, the symbolic formation or the symptom formation. What is cut off and repressed, kind of in the Lacanian way, returns in the real, right? Because what's converted is the mental repression shows in the body, right? So whether it be Dora's cough or various other, I'm trying to think uh, of another example, but um, in any case, the um, so what's so the it's interesting that for Freud, it's like, okay, so the hysteric is uh, the symbol, which he calls A, right? He's again simplifying. So A appears and the hysteric goes wild, but it's not in fact A that is causing this. It's the fact that A is standing in for B, the repressed, the thing, das Ding, um, and it's actually B that is the cause of the suffering. But the conscious links, the mental links between A and B, the symbol and the thing, are disrupted. And it's in those gaps, those interstices between A and B, that the symptoms emerge, and that the psychoanalyst, you could use all kinds of analogies, rather either as a geologist has to uncover the strata that are hidden, or as a as Deleuze and Guattari might say, as a cartographer has to map out the unconscious dynamically in order to see the connections that aren't uh, there on the surface. But again, I think for Freud, and I think he shows this, and one of the reasons why he's interested in memory formation and all of this is that it's not enough to just say, "Oh, here's the thing you're repressing." If it were that simple, then all you could easily use the hypnotic method and lull the ego to sleep, or whatever metaphor you want to use, and in order to bypass the sensors and get to the thing. And then once the analyst knows, all he has to do is says, okay, so I've delved into your unconscious, here's what you're repressing. If psychoanalysis worked like that, it would obviously be a much easier process. But what I think that it would also show that humans are much more mechanical and robotic, right? I mean, that's as though there were a hard drive that had data corruption, and all it took was, a simple a program to recover some lost storage.
So what do you think about this? I mean, I did mention Kant a bit earlier at the beginning, so it feels like the Kant and sort of Lacan connection here is, I don't know, interesting, or right, because it's like, for example, the PTSD sufferer, like you mentioned from World War One, right? It's
Yes.
like there's an intrusion of the real, there's an intrusion of like the noumena or whatever that's too overwhelming. Like it strikes the body, and then the mind is overwhelmed by that excitation, and then so has to bind it to some type of a symbol in order to achieve that equilibrium as far as the psychical energy distribution is, or whatever is concerned. Are you following? Am I
See,
right?
you're right, but just one caveat. If
Sure.
you remember in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, one of the things that Freud says, and this is a paradox that I don't know if empirical research can follow up on, but anecdotally, he reports treating these soldiers, and that for him, those who suffered wounds in war, as a rule of thumb for Freud, were less affected by the mental stresses than those who came out unscathed. And Freud has to try to like reason through why is it you would
Yeah.
think that suffering like a bodily injury would actually leave you more vulnerable to psychic uh, reworking. And what he suggests is that, almost drawing on his paper from narcissism, which he published at the beginning of the war in 1914, maybe before it even started. I would have to look. When you and I have discussed this before, but he suggests that the wound, the physical wound, that the energies that the ego has to, what he calls ego cathexes, right? That the energies that the body itself, the ego too, has to. And again, remember, the ego is not, at least in this point, for him, not all of the ego is equivalent with consciousness. So I just want to, just in case this sounds confusing, but for Freud, there's a narcissistic investment in healing the wound. Energies are investing into this area, literally like trying to occupy it and fight back against this breach in the body. And because of that, there is less energy that is going on sort of psychically, unconsciously, in order to form these traumatic, um, whether we call them memories, and in this stage he might think of it as memory formation, but these the body breach takes so much energy that it prevents the psychical breach. Now, whether or not, again, whether or not research would bear this out, and I'm sure there have been studies, I would be interested to see if there's a reputation of that. But
Yeah.
for Freud, he takes that as a rule of thumb, and he seems to be suggesting that, because again, at this stage, he is thinking about, and he uses this framework in Morning and Melancholia, and on narcissism, where he's thinking about two different types of cathexes, right? Which we can kind of map onto this 1895 piece, but he's thinking about the ego cathexes, which would be more endogenous, right? And object cathexes. And he even tries to theorize, if you remember in the Schreber case, he even tries to theorize schizophrenia, the onset of Schreber's delirium, by this interplay of object cathexes and ego cathexes. And this is specifically the framework he's still using in Morning and Melancholia, where when the loved one dies, those object cathexes swarm back in and reinvest the whole store of available psychical energy. And it's that, for Freud, that is painful, that we take back in from these investments that we've laid out. We get this whole surplus of energy that we don't know what to do with. And I think that he sees that as an easier thing to deal with, even though it requires a grieving process. He gives it a weird, arbitrary 1.5 year kind of normal span of grieving. Whereas with melancholy, it's much more difficult because the loved one is still there, still out in reality, right? Still, um, available, so to speak, for reinvestment. And that makes it more painful because, um, you know, because of the facilitations, the breaching or the pathways that neurones take. If we use the language of this essay in 1895, they, as he says, I think is it in Morning of Melancholia, Coop, one of your favorite lines that the a libidinal position is never like willingly
Right.
substituted or given up. So
Correct. Yeah.
there's something about this that I think we can see in the 1895, where the facilitations that neurones have reached have path braked those well-worn paths. And we can think about this too, without needing to talk to experts about like neurological plasticity, right? Like there's a reason why sometimes habits are hard to break, right? I mean, that's kind of the common sense, to put Freud into like common sense language, right? That habit formations, it takes some time and takes some conscious effort to try to disinvest these old paths, whether we call it desire, because this gets us to like anti-Oedipus stuff, right? In the three syntheses. We sort of have to put some energy to overcome, at least to like equal it, if not put more energy into overcoming sort of the habitual paths that our desire has flown through, or our and Freud will often use this language of when he's talking about libido, like I mentioned with the object cathexes or the ego cathexes. He will use this language of a river, right? There's almost a sense in which to overcome the resistance of these old libidinal positions, we almost have to like build a dam and dry up a river to keep the flows from going there. So I do think this language of I don't like that Strachey translates it as facilitations. I think it's much easier to see Derrida's language, because in Derrida in French it's frayage, which is literally there's a fracturing going on. There are little paths being broken, breached, right? And in order for the flows to take the currents to run in certain pre-mapped areas. And so it is interesting that in order to like overcome these old habits or these old libidinal positions, you kind of have to strangle or dry up the flows, the paths, and wall them off, which is what repression does unconsciously. But Freud does also too think about something that's not quite unconscious repression. He'll talk about suppression. You can suppress a thought, which is obviously a conscious effort.
So you mentioned anti-Oedipus. I couldn't help but think about the relationship to like something like the system of cruelty.
Yeah.
And like the marking of the body, right?
And the primitive territorial machine. Yeah.
So it's almost like the system of cruelty, like with the marking of the body, like it has a psychical dimension as maybe as like a method of repressing or I don't know, dealing with neuroticism or something I don't know if that tracks. Do you kind of see what I'm saying relative to like, I don't know, there's something about this example of the soldier that has a wound versus the
I see
the non-wounded, the unwounded
I see what you're
person, and
saying.
the unwounded person being more neurotic, because if we're drawing from this piece where the psychical energy, the Q, has a material basis, if you're starting from that point, then it kind of does make sense. It follows that, okay, well, the somatic tissue through the wound has, like, there's been a type of release or something, whereas that energy in the unwounded person is unbound, whereas in the wounded person it's sort of tied to the symbol of the wound itself. So I was just that's where I was kind of wondering, okay, what does this say about the system of cruelty and the marking of the body relative to the unconscious?
Man, well, sticking with the soldier before going back to the primitive territorial machine and bridging, it is interesting that there would be a massive influx of Q of the external excitation in a wound, gunshot, for example, right? And for Freud, I think that all things being equal, there's a finite store of energy that the psychical apparatus is going to process, whether it be Q and therefore external stimuli, or queta, right? The internal psychical endogenous drive based or instinct based energy in terms of investment, right? In terms of what the psychical apparatus can deal with, which is why there's a tendency to keep it constant and to divest. Neurones are divesting energy, right? In Freud's schema. And he kind of keeps to that all throughout, even and beyond the pleasure principle. He's still thinking about, as we've seen, that the psychical apparatus, its job is to keep the energy constant or minimum.
Yeah.
Um,
Which I think
and
maybe even as well, here's where the joke or like laughter or what have you feels like such a underappreciated or understudied
yeah,
aspect of this whole perhaps even discussion, because of the way that right, like the laughter, it's interesting, right? The way that it, right, because that you can kind of see how that is the psychical energy being somatically uh evacuated, or
yeah.
I don't know what the right, I can't come up with the right term for it. Evacuated was the closest thing I
No, that's right. I mean, he talks about satisfaction of a drive as the elimination
a
of
pressure
the
or whatever.
lowering of pressure of drawing of energy. Yeah, evacuation is perfect. And dreams do something like this too, right? The residues of the previous day, those intensities, they there's a, I think Freud sees in in jokes and in dreams a similar mechanism of venting, if we can use that word to stand in for evacuating, right? A sort of venting the pressure, the drawing, and also in the way in which jokes bypass the censor, right? They get at something, whether socially or psychologically repressed, and are able to lift the veil a bit, and that's precisely where the joke lands or doesn't, right? How well it's able to bypass the censor and 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 do this.
I mean,
I go ahead.
just real quick, I wanted to mention, yeah, I was thinking about laughing, like laughter. Whenever you laugh at something that, I don't know, like you have something bad happens to you, or there's a bit of news or what have you that affects you, and it's like it's bad, but you just laugh because it's so, I don't know. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. I think
Instead of crying, right?
that's an
Or instead
interesting
of
twist on the joke and laughter, as far as, I don't know, like obviously it still deals with the evacuation of the energy, but it's just an interesting thing that phenomenon, I suppose.
yeah, it's a way of preventing a psychical wound from forming, right? Like you can laugh at a terrible situation, you can cry, and of course, self-deprecation or joking can become pathological, right? It can become symptomatic of, um, it can become a defense mechanism, and uh, that too is similar to dreams. And there's something where Freud says, like, and I'm not sure if we need to take him as imperative as he comes across in the joke book, but when he's like, laughter lifts the repression, and as soon as the joke is over, slams it back down just as hard. There's something similar going on in dreams, where the dream is able to do a do a detour around the censor and filter in, the wish fulfillment, or the in the dream formation, is able to sort of allow these symptoms free reign, where they wouldn't have with the predominance of the ego in waking life. And I think there's something in the dream that's symptomatic, and obviously something in the joke that's symptomatic, that both can provide ample material for psychoanalytic uh, investigation and working through. Um, and yeah, so I guess with the marking of bodies and Anti-Oedipus, I guess the main difference would be that it's not so much obviously a question about um, the the language that Freud uses in Beyond Good and Evil is something about how there is a almost like the ego acts as this protective shell against trauma, just as the epidermis or the bones or the muscles provide the shell from the internal working of the organs, right? And so the breaching of the body takes up all the energy that could have breached the protective layer of the ego, which is why he will analogize the ego as a kind of body image, right? Is it's a kind of representative of the integrity of the body to a certain extent, um, but applied to the psychical, right? Um, I guess I would say with the marking of bodies, there's obviously a dimension that Freud will doesn't spend enough time on, but there's obviously a much more social rather than psychical operation going on. And this is why Deleuze and Guattari kind of describe it as this matrix between the hand that performs the incisions of the initiatory rituals, because most of these markings of bodies are a type of initiation, whether it be adolescents becoming adults, right, passing some trial that they had to perform. They give some examples, or it could be the mark of the condemned, right? The marking of the bodies of the condemned persons, precisely because the cruelty of culture did not, those markings of the body did not stick, that the condemned has to be undergo a certain type of violence. So there's the hand that performs the violence. There is the eye that extracts the surplus value, whether it be the eye of each and every person available, the elders, or the chief, right? However you want to formulate it. And so, in that sense, like this working out, this extraction of surplus value for the social mechanisms at play doesn't necessarily easily correlate. But I would say that where I would find a correlation is if for Deleuze and Guattari, before exchange can even take place, because for them exchange is not primary. The primary thing that for exchange to be possible, transcendentally even, is the marking of bodies. Right, it's marking that is primary. I do think that stands in a relationship with the way that Freud begins by talking about the neurones, whether it be the phi neurones that are the permeable ones that allow the current and energies to pass, or the psi neurones, which will constitute the place of memory. And it's not a question why he chose psi, the Greek letter for psychical, right? Because they make memory possible. And then there's obviously he has to throw in the omega, which, as Strachey points out, looks like a lowercase w, which would stand in for what's the word Wahrnehmung, perception, right? So you have the perception neurones, you got these three neurones, but I think that in this case, instead of any one neurone, the marking of bodies is what neurones are originally doing before neurones can intercommunicate and interlink and act as contact barriers for these energies passing through the cycle system. There has to be whether we call it, like Strachey, a facilitation. A path has to be forged, right? Paths have to be marked out and breached. And so I see something like what's primary in the primitive territorial machine of marking what's primary in the psychical apparatus in the 1895 piece that we're talking about is the marking out, if you will, of paths for the neurones to quote unquote facilitate these currents going on. Before neurones can exchange energy, there has to be a marking out of the paths through which these exchanges occur. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. What relationship would you say? Because I don't know, maybe I was trying to draw some type of connection to like the recording surface.
Yeah. Oh man, I mean, well, it's interesting, right? That I had you kind of re-look over the first 10 pages of Derrida's Freud and the Scene of Writing, because he wants to try to show this interesting connection between the 1895 project that we're talking about and the 25, so 30 years later, the Note on the Mystic Writing Pad, which we've also discussed, right? So yeah, I mean, in terms of the recording surface of the Socius, which is one of the primary definitions of what Deleuze and Guattari call the Socius, yeah, it would be interesting. I hadn't thought about this, but it would be interesting to maybe we had discussed this in the writing pad, and I had forgotten. My sine neurones are obviously not as impermeable as I would like. No, the recording surface and the Mystic Writing Pad obviously have analogies, and it's almost a question of scale, right? But I mean, that's the same thing with the way in which Deleuze and Guattari are able to move from the body without organs of a schizophrenic, or of, let's say, an individual undergoing the markings and the primitive territorial machines initiations, versus the sort of summative, non-totalizable yet cumulative bodies without organs of all the, whether it be the little tribe or whatnot, that constitute this reporting surface of the Socius. Yeah, I mean, I do think that if we abstract away from some of the more complex language of Anti-Oedipus, they that really doesn't, not a lot of it moves over into, say, A Thousand Plateaus or later. It's a very experimental type of conceptual working out of all of these things. If we kind of generalize and think about how the recording surface of the Socius is, I'm going to be very generalizing and probably do a disservice to Deleuze and Guattari, so stick with me. But I'm thinking about how the recording surface, with its markings and facilitations, to use the Freudian language, there's what's being recorded is, let's say, the inscriptions and reinscriptions and iterations of norms and values. That's not the language that Deleuze and Guattari use by any means, right? But there is a way in which what is being recorded is the very basis for norms and values that are sort of, they're obviously open to the pressures of reality, but in a certain extent they act kind of like principles of constancy in Freud, right? There's this sense in which this is where the various taboos come from, right? For Deleuze and Guattari, it's much more complex than Freud makes out the incest taboo, for example. For Deleuze and Guattari, you can't deduce from the fact that incest is prohibited to the fact that it was desired. They say that's a distortion and an illusion. But in any case, we do know that these systems of taboos, as we've discussed in Totem and Taboo, are part and parcel of these primitive territorial machines. And so we do need to think of them as instituting certain norms that promote and dynamize certain values. One of which we've talked about with Pierre Claster, right, is the hunter, the the exclusive disjunction of the hunter not eating his own kill, and how that facilitates, rather than isolating the hunter and threatening his life, it actually promotes social bonding. And so I go out and, as a good hunter, I do my duty, and I bring back and feed others first and foremost. But that facilitates me being taken care of in this communal setting by others who do the same. Does that make like I, now? Yes, recording surface sounds very abstract here, but I do think that if we think about the psychical apparatus that Freud's trying to draw out with the neurones and how they interwork, and how at least one of the neurones, at the very least one, though it doesn't work alone, functions as memory. The impermeable neurones, the psi, there's a sense in which the recording surface being elaborated and mapped out here and diagrammed, there's a way in which the flows of desire constitute a recording surface in this territorial machine, precisely because it's mapping out the iterations of norms and values that become more or less stabilized, right? And concrete. And I think this is, I'm sorry, one last thing. I think this is why Simondon is very clear about quote unquote progress in societies, that technical progress can itself cut its own legs out from under it and kill its own momentum if society is not able to progress and develop values that incorporate it. Right, that societal progress needs to be in tandem with technological progress. Otherwise, it completely defeats its means of being elaborated and taken up and promoting new values. If technical progress outstrips social progress, they become in contradiction rather than promoting one another, which is why I think clusters again is like, look, the tools that the hunter gatherers are using, these, to clear brush, for example, they once they take up the steel axes instead of the stone axes, they can get their jobs done more quickly. But why is it that leads to this vicious cycle that actually undercuts the norms and values that they have in place, and actually leads to them succumbing to their way of life being threatened? For example, with one of the things he suggests is there's an easy access, or there's a promotion of values of accumulation of surplus value. And that is in contradiction to their quote unquote subsistence life. And if listeners who have read Claster know his critique of the stereotype of subsistence, there's an interesting thing by introducing these new technical tools, actually promotes certain social values that lead to the very threatening and risk of that way of life. It was a bit of a detour, I'm sorry, but
No, it's a good one, because I think that kind of points to like the notion of what is it, metabolic rift in a certain way, like there being this kind of the accumulatory, the repetition of the process of accumulation threatening the very, I mean, we can see that played out so clearly, I think, today, which is pretty astute on Simondon's part. I can't remember what episode it was that I was drawing connections between this marking on the body, like the system of cruelty, as a type of like a sort of ledger, a notation of debt, a notation of obligation, let's say, that is directly recorded on the body I don't know, that's interesting, right? Versus the way that, you know what I mean, like fiat currencies, for example, like there's the debt is what allows us to create money for exchange. So it's interesting that there's this marking on the body that symbolizes a debt that the individual owes to the collective as far as obligation to produce for others, but also recognition of one's own sustenance via the collective.
And and positively also indicates a belonging. Hypothetically, right? Um, you are now one of us. We've all had to be marked, right?
Yeah, so it's almost like you're, for the purposes of exchange, let's say, uh, right, if you're not marked with the tribe's whatever particular marking, are you owed anything as far as your
Right.
own survival and sustenance and what have you?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. The marks that do not take, as I said, one of the examples would have been the body of the condemned. It's precisely because, and Nietzsche theorizes this. I believe they even mention it in passing, and it's precisely because the body of the criminal, those initial marks that should have made him belong, did not take. It's as though they didn't take. They didn't stick. That the criminal has to be punished corporeally. Let's see. Yeah. I mean, talked a little bit about some Deleuze and Guattari. We've walked through some of the stuff, although, as always, in the Freudian manner of defeating symptoms, we've taken a detour, which I think is fine. One of the things that I do like out of this whole piece, because part one really goes through all of the neurological terminology, sets up the ideas. We've already talked about some of them, the difference between external stimuli, internal stimuli. We touched at least a little bit upon phi, which I take to be standing for physical, in the sense of like physical external neurones. Psi, the psychical internal neurones. Again, obviously the outside and inside is a little problematic, but it fits when we think about Trieb. And then omega, as I said, the little W standing for the capital W that he'll use to Vornehmung perception, right? So these three neurones, this triad of neurones working together, all of that is part of part one, and how um, baked into that is various things like reality testing, which will become important for him. This is the beyond of the pleasure principle, right? The way in which we take a detour from immediate satisfaction of drives, immediate pleasure, to go beyond the pleasure principle in order for, in fact, interestingly enough, almost a greater store of pleasure, right? Almost a greater satisfaction. So, to a certain extent, yeah, we're beyond the pleasure principle, but the reality principle still shows that in the end, are we actually obeying the pleasure principle, but just a delayed gratification, right? Um, so, all of that's baked into part one, and extremely important, very technical. As I mentioned to you before we started recording, Freud never really revised this. He didn't publish it. And so it does read, even with Strachey's editorial insertions and corrections, it's a slog compared to what I think about reading Freud with you. Generally, even if it gets technical, it's he's a good writer, I would say. And so I do want to give those listening who want to read this, it does take some patience. And I think sometimes it's not going to read very well. I will say it's at the start of part two, we moved from the neurological to part two is titled, I don't know if this is his title or not, but it's titled Psychopathology. And it is, I think that what I told you as soon as I got to part two was I feel like he wrote all of part one to give a ground to part two, because part two is stuff that you and I have talked about and are very familiar with, which is what is psychoanalysis trying to do and to actually like treat in terms of symptom formations, right? So obviously, one of the first books he published with Breuer, or Brower, oh wait, yeah, Breuer, like Freud, was hysteria. So we get at the very start his way of, and this is on page 347. Every observer of hysteria is struck in the first place by the fact that hysterical patients are subject to a compulsion, which he italicizes or underlines, which is exercised by excessively intense ideas. And maybe we could like pause there and talk a little bit, because I think it's interesting. He will say, look, excessively intense ideas also occur normally, right? Like the example I gave of the soldier dying for the scrap of cloth. Um, that's an excessively intense idea, right? And I think that it's interesting for Freud. What makes the hysteric different is that um, the subject is basically the patient. The hysteric is unaware of the where that intensity is going, or somehow diverts it to the symbol, right? That we talked about. And he says these hysterical, excessively intense ideas strike us as odd. They are ideas which in other people have no consequences and whose importance we can make nothing of. They appear to us as intruders and usurpers, and accordingly as ridiculous. That again is interesting, this notion of intruders and usurpers, because we talked about how the language of cathexis, right, which translates the German Besetzung, which in French is investment, right, the language that Deleuze and Guattari use, that it also means to occupy an area, like in war. So the fact that it's almost like there's a foreign invader, there's a foreign cathexis going on, a cathexis that seems strange, as though it were a stranger or alien, and usurps an appropriate investment, or a quote unquote like the occupation of a homeland, and that's why it seems so odd. I do think that language of intruder and usurper, there's an intrusion uh, of libidinal investment.
I don't know. I mean, this doesn't quite really tie with what you're just saying, but I can't help but think to the notions before when you were mentioning like the delayed gratification sort of thing, and how like this would be like immediate satisfaction versus delayed gratification and just economic sort of development. The notion of like monetary or capital investment, right? That
Mm.
is,
Mm-hmm.
it's a different way of structuring desire in a way that corresponds with the like the self-preservative aspects of our right, because it's like foregoing the immediate pleasure of expenditure, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if I have $100, right, and it's like I can save that money, I can invest that money, I can spend that money
Right.
by
Spending the money would be the immediate gratification, right?
correct, yes, versus like the preference of like the which really ties, I think, to the three syntheses of the unconscious and the three syntheses of time for Deleuze, because it's like that's when the future comes into play, right? That's where the
The third
future,
synthesis, or you meant the synthesis of consumption, consummation, right? Um, where the little store of satisfaction that falls Schreber's way from pleasing God, from getting fucked by God, right? It's like I have to give constant pleasure to God. I got a little bit of that back.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a hard point, but it just, I don't know. That's where my mind was going as far as like, it even goes back to the notion of the primitive territorial machine and the marking of the body relative to that debt that's marked by the incision or whatever in the ceremony of whatever initiatory marking or what have you, because it's like there's the impetus, like the telos of the whole prospect or project is to create this kind of social equilibrium, this
Mhm.
kind of zero state similar to the unconscious, right?
Yeah,
by
yeah.
by having us forego our immediate desires. For example, the hunter example you gave, right?
Yep.
Instead of just immediately like, I'm hungry, I'm gonna immediately eat this thing.
Yeah.
I'm immediately gonna spend this $100 on myself or what have you, versus I'm going to save this and invest it in the social, so
Yeah.
to speak. Although I don't know how good that really works, because even, in capitalism, just by circulating it, like capitalism almost feeds on my that duality of investment and consumption. So my immediate consumption is taken as a positive in the sense that it increases the speed of exchange or what have you, and I'm by me fulfilling my immediate desire, I'm kind of investing in the general welfare of wealth creation or
Right. I mean,
velocity of money or something like that.
yes, I would say that the actual instead of the difference being between immediately using or consuming that 100, right, versus, as Marx himself says, it's when the investment of the 100 begets the extra 10. That's when you have capital, right? um the difference isn't so much between those two, because, as you said, you're still circulating that money, whether you spend it immediately or you invest it. The real difference, the one who stands out as different, would be the miser, who takes that 100 and actually takes it out of circulation, right? And hoards it under their bed. That would be the quote unquote asocial from this standpoint. Instead of like actually putting that money back into circulation, like you said, taking it out of circulation, that's the what the miser does is seen as asocial, um, from capitalism point of view, from the point of view of money, from the point of view of consumption. Now, I think that what's interesting too, though, is obviously there's a little bit of enjoyment, obviously, that comes from the miser or the hoarder, but it is seen as asocial from from that standpoint. And yeah, I mean, like, to maybe to take a tangent, there's the because Freud starts with the hysteric, but we will think about later. We will see, uh, because he talks about compulsion. We will see, like, in obsessive compulsions, like in the Ratman case, where he's ironing his money, right, as though literally the money itself were dirty, right? Freud himself has essays linking shit and gold, or money, right? Money and shit. So the obsessive compulsive of the one of the Ratman's compulsive obsessions is to almost try to, like, make the money clean, the physical money, right? The florins that he has, by ironing them. um, and I the circulation of bodies.
You cut out there for a second.
Yeah,
Actually.
I was thinking about how the circulation of money, the circulation of bodies, the commodities is very much linked to what Deleuze and Guattari say, like men are never more homosexual than when they arrange marriages. And if you remember in the Rat Man, he's got this fantasy between marrying the rich woman, but desiring and therefore pleasing his father, who he has murderous intent toward, supposedly, from Freud's reading, versus desiring the poor woman. This crux: do I follow what my father did and marry the rich woman that's been arranged for me, or do I marry the poor woman that I desire, who reminds me of my nurses, right? Which would be the substitute, if you will, closest substitute for the mother figure. There's a sense in which circulation is also, you see this in various conservative types of paranoia, where body count in terms of women and virginity becomes idealized and fetishized. It's precisely the circulation of women and that arranged marriage is trying to regulate. And so this is the same kind of discourse you see in the paradox you see in fighting against feminism, right? If women have control of their bodies, then they're going to sort of ruin masculinity by not forcibly giving themselves to the arrangement of marriages and breeding. Yet at the same time, if they have control of their bodies, they're going to circulate and therefore ruin their. So either way, there's the double bind where they're kind of forced into this fabricated path of, as Deleuze and Guattari say, to bring back Kant, the Roman sort of legal definition of marriage is ownership of the partner's genitalia, genital organs. So, precisely, it's exchange that takes on this valence of dirt for the rat man's obsessive compulsion.
I know we kind of have, I mean, we've delved into it a bit, but I don't know if you want to maybe explicitly work through the ties between the three types of neurone and the three syntheses of the unconscious, and a more, since that was kind of like the impetus to have this discussion, and then maybe we can finish up there.
I mean, sure, I guess.
I mean, even I think it would be good too to mention, I have this text up here about the break flows. I think that's an interesting tie as well.
Well, if we take phi neurones, the quote, as I've said, quote unquote, physical, but they're the permeable neurones. They're the ones that are supposed to send off energy, right? They're the ones that facilitate the. They would stand in roughly, again, very analogically, for the connective synthesis, the and, right? They're helping to run the energy along the way, and they don't necessarily take in recording, just as in the in the Freudian model of the writing pad, right? They are the sheath that that the pen bears down on, right? But
The membrane.
The membrane, right? You lift it, and it's back to a blank state, right? Because Derrida points this out. If you remember, Freud's trying to think about this system where it really is kind of two systems, if you will, the physical and perceptual, if we want to think of the omega and the phi neurones working in tandem, they are supposed to be ever virgin. It's interesting that we came back to virginity, but they are supposed to be ever fresh and blank. Whereas this alone doesn't get us anything close to memory, because we need the fresh, receptive, blank slate and a sort of inexhaustible fund that can soak up all of these inscriptions without ever being full. So you need the inexhaustible depths of memory and the ever blank slate, virgin ground of perception. Which is why for Freud, perception and memory do not occur side by side. Now, this is different than say Bergson, who wants to say that memory and recognition is always accompanying perception. They're always mixed. I think for Freud, while that may be true, I think he's thinking about the inscriptive process and not the actual, the recording process in this case, and not the actual object recognition. He's less concerned about objects and the different levels of perception than he is about these systems where perception is pre-conscious and conscious and has nothing to do with the sort of unconscious, which never forgets. um, the conscious doesn't need to remember; it just needs to be like sensitive to intensities. But there's a different system that's soaking up all of these and recording them. And so, in that sense, the connective synthesis we could see in the phi, they are permeable and they are facilitating energy running along the way. The impermeable, the psi neurones are meant to primarily be functioning for memory and for allowing memory to take place. And so they would be the disjunctive, in the sense of or, which is why Freud, even in this essay, is thinking about how error can occur. It can occur to lack of attention. It can occur to these faulty syllogisms and these bad premises or bad consequences, deductions. And I think that it's in that sense that if we think of omega, which is where consciousness and like sensation is supposed to occur, be facilitated, where we can actually have a conscious state out of this interplay of perception or of physical stimulation and internal retention going on and interacting, then yeah, that would be the realm where the subject is in the sweep of the arc along the facilitations, right? That's me in emerging out of all of this neuronal interplay. Where I think it breaks down is that the only thing we need to be very clear on is precisely because the disjunctive syntheses are on the level of recording that they can be analogized with the psi neurones. But I do think that each and every one of the neurones is disjunctive, right? We are thinking about series that are converging and diverging. So I think that it's obviously more complicated than situating one of the neurones on the side of one of the syntheses, right? It's very much, and just as the syntheses are immediately, production is immediately recording is immediately consumption, and it, like, you know what I'm saying, like so it's the same kind of continuity and complexity that we find in the syntheses and in the neurones.
I was going to point to something like I guess the gaps, and maybe I'm thinking too much of contemporary neurology or whatever, or even just like the way that there's a gap between neurons, right? And the electrical charge that breaches that gap. It's almost like can't help but think maybe this is getting a hint towards like Derrida would be like it's the punctuation of the sentence, right? That break in the flow of writing would have a certain similarity in terms of, right? Because like if we just have a one run on sentence versus that would sort of be like similar to the flow of undifferentiated energy per se, right? Because there's like, or even that could perhaps could go to the real or noumena or what have you, right? Because it's unfiltered uh, material. It's undifferentiated material, rather, would be maybe the better way to say it. So you can't really, you have to break it up. There has to be break flows, or there has to be like, I'm thinking maybe even of where when someone's speaking, right? There has to be a, like being able to pick up the breaks, let's say in a foreign language, right? Because you're not as accustomed to
Yes.
being able to identify where those breaks are. And that's one of the most important aspects of being able to understand another language or another person would be those, we need a stopping point, or we need some type of gap to be able to communicate or to be able to use that to interpret that language or what have you. And the way that, similarly within like the way that neurons function, there has to be a gap rather than this continuous circuit, because I guess that would be more of like an automaton that can't really respond to, you know what I mean? That would be like a machine that is like just does literally what it is programmed to, and it doesn't have the ability to iterate in a
Yes.
way that something that has acts, like if there are gaps, then that makes the ability to interpret or something like that possible. I don't know if that's,
No, I do think that's right though. I mean, it's the gaps, the interstices that I mean, this is the same thing with Simondon when he thinks about it leads to different orders of magnitude. There has to be some sort of what he calls disparateness or disparation, just like in our vision, right? Our left eye and our right eye are not completely superposable, which is why the tension between them, that gap in their images, is what allows us to have three-dimensional vision. It's the three-dimensional vision is the solution uh, of that tiny shift between our left and right eye. But also to go back to your point about the breaks, we know what happens if we force our eyes open for too long, and the way that our vision starts to get blurry, our images start to merge and combine into almost a blob. The blinks between provide our vision with the means for resetting, and it's just the same way in speech when the patterns of breaths forcing in speech forcing an interlocutor to take a breath, even to the point of where that might indicate an ability for us to launch a response. I mean, all of those are necessary, and I think that they are implied not just in the syntheses, but also in the neurones, in the just as we've talked about with like Leibniz and the convergence and divergence of series leading to compossible and incompossible worlds, right? We can think of the same thing. We can think of a serialization of the pathways, the facilitations of the neurones, of the rhizomatic mapping of the brain or whatnot. That you're right. The breaks are obviously just as important as the flows. I guess if we wanted to just to leave off, and what would be like one of the, I think you've told me this before. I know it's been a couple of weeks since we discussed since you texted me this, but like what would be like one of the one passages or like points that he made that really stood out to you, if you recall? I know we have your notes from the bottom at the bottom of the page. Maybe there was a banger or two that you saw.
Mm, I mean, my biggest interest, like I said, was the kind of the ties to the three syntheses. I thought that was just really super fascinating.
Yeah,
So I don't know if I really had much else. I'm kind of looking through to see if there's anything that stands out.
yeah, I would say that for the three syntheses of time, we would need to look at difference of repetition, chapter 2, um, and work through that, which I'm sure we will at some point. That's I suppose that for me, as a big takeaway instead of a passage, I did think that one of the things to get out of this was how much in embryo, the embryonic forms of a lot of his concepts and terminology and moves he's going to make in psychoanalysis is here. It's not necessarily fully formed, obviously, right? That's why I said it's embryonic, and I do think that some of it may not be more absolutely clearly stated, but I think that a lot of the rudiments, a lot of the elements are there and give a sense of where he's going to go. I obviously wouldn't recommend this as a starter text um, for a reader of Freud. Um, I think it logically should come last, and why he probably didn't publish it, but even if it chronologically comes first. So,
I think this little section is pretty interesting, although it divulges a little bit or diverges rather from a lot of what we've discussed. But I'm going to read it because it also does mention too that I think this mentions the soldier as well. But I thought this was interesting. I'm going to go ahead and read the whole thing, maybe repeating. The formation of symbols also takes place normally. A soldier will sacrifice himself for a many-colored scrap of stuff on a pole because it has become the symbol of his fatherland, and no one thinks that neurotic. But a hysterical symbol behaves differently. The knight who fights for his lady's glove knows, in the first place, that the glove owes its importance to the lady, and secondly, he is in no way prevented by his adoration of the glove from thinking of the lady and serving her in other respects. The hysteric who weeps at A is quite unaware that he is doing so on account of the association A to B, and B itself plays no part at all in his psychical life. The symbol has in this case taken the place of the thing entirely. This assertion is correct in the strictest sense. We can convince ourselves that whether anything is evoked from outside or by association, which should in effect cathect B, A enters consciousness instead of it. Indeed, one can infer the nature of B from the provoking causes which in a remarkable fashion evoke A. So
yeah, I mean that could
I
be the cold open.
I think the interesting aspect here is like not only like the kind of broader libidinal economics of courtly love versus, we talked about, you gave your example about the trading of women, etc. Not to mention, but like the partial, the kind of the fetish object or the partial object, and this relation to the favor, the lady's favor within courtly love, and
Yes.
invest in the investment in these these shards or these pieces is kind of interesting.
Yeah, the the knight in the example does not confuse the glove, the symbol of the lady, for the thing. Right? It's kind of interesting. Even though, as Freud says, we conventionally don't think the soldier to be neurotic or hysteric by conflating, if not confusing, the flag for the investment in, the nation, which again is an abstract thing, if you will, abstract in the sense of not something touchable and palpable, even if it's still very real. But the hysteric is closer to the soldier than to the knight, right? Again, interesting analogies Freud is bringing up here. But the hysteric is much closer to the soldier dying for this scrap of stuff on a pole. Again, I think we do need to see Freud being obviously a little bit, I'm not going to say, what's the word? He's definitely not feeling any sort of jingoist nationalist pride here by saying that, right? You know, the hysteric is closer to the soldier than to the knight, than to the chivalry, than to the courtly knight. So yeah, I think that's interesting. I do think that perhaps the one difference would be Freud would point out, well, if you the question would be whether which soldier, and if you talk to the soldier and let them know that the flag is not the thing, what kind of confusion or what kind of response would you get? Because you can very well imagine certain soldiers being like, yeah, of course, but others perhaps persisting in a certain denial, a certain misunderstanding of where their libidinal investment is placed. So that would be a gauge of hysteria in the soldiers that he's somewhat mocking here.
I mean, it's an interesting little like singularity relative to a couple of different strains of thought that we've talked about. One is relative to, I mean, and you didn't talk about this today, but we've mentioned before, it's like, what is it about the fetish object allowing that kind of short circuits some type of process? Do you know what I'm talking about? Where is it the pervert, or I can't remember what the fucking
Well, I mean, one of the
terminology was.
well, we have, yeah, and Zizek's talked about this. The pervert. Why would the pervert want the whole woman when he can get off on a scrap of cloth? Or it just to, in a different sense, it facilitates. Um, it's able to run the whole circuit and stand in, right? Um, and it works even better.
Yeah,
There's
the investiture in the part object, or the shard, or
yeah.
the residue, or the, like, I don't know what is that a surplus? Is that a surplus jouissance? I don't know if I can back that up. I'm just freestyling a little bit there, but
Well, it's the it definitely allows for, I mean, otherwise there wouldn't be the perversion, right? It definitely allows for that surplus. And it would be hell to have the whole person when really all you want is that part, is that symbol, is that fetish. And yeah, so there's a paradox where the full jouissance can't be got with the full person.
we kind of see this with this kind of like chauvinism that masquerades as patriotism, right? Because the investiture is in the part. You know what I mean? It's like there's a disavowal, or there's like a repression of the right. Like, I'm invested in this particular transcendent symbol of the nation more so than I am invested in the actual people that comprise the body politic, let's say, right? Because I'm willing
yeah.
to forego the law, or et cetera, to pursue this kind of like exclusionary notion of patriotism or chauvinism. And I can get off on that a lot more than I can on the actual real composition of the nation, let's say, right? And start seeing my own countrymen as enemies and as others and as exclusions or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's why in the South, as you know, we still have more than one flag, and which one is more libidinally invested, right?
Right. Yeah.
Is it the stars and bars, or is it
Yeah.
the Confederate flag, right? It's one of them elicits a more visceral reaction in the South. Now, this may have changed a little bit, but not for our people of our age. As you know, growing up, that was very much still like that was the flag to show that you belonged, right? You're to be in the in group was um, to be at least, if not more so, invested in the Confederate flag. So it's interesting that that's and then the American flag could really stand in and really just be a veil for the investments that symbolized in the Confederate flag, right?
That's one strain of thought where this courtly love discussion makes sense. The other strain, I think, is in terms of like the reality principle, the nirvana, maybe not the nirvana principle, but not the reality principle, but the pleasure principle in the sense that the courtly love situation where the knight, if they like, what's the word? If they act on their love, if they act like if they were to consummate
Mhm.
the union, that obviously is a threat to their person, right? So they have to go there by they bypass that, they defer their instant gratification by this different type of satisfaction that's drawn out rather than sort of, I don't know, let's say used up all at once, like in the consummation of the act or what have you. Like this is, you know what I mean? It's kind of like an ongoing masturbatory process that simulates or
What's the kind of gooning, right? The idealization is
right.
is
Yeah.
is the goal rather than so there's a kind of perpetual edging and gooning. And we see that too in discussions of fantasy, right? The fantasy itself is uh, the libidinal investment in sort of getting the thing is disastrous, right? It's ruinous for the symbolic framework and coordinates of desire. Um, Now, obviously, that doesn't pertain to everything wished for, really meaning fantasy in the strict sort of Freudian, Lacanian, Ziziekian sense. But um, but yeah, getting the thing, dog catches car, right? It's not always what it. I mean, and that's all throughout folklore and tall tales and whatnot, right? And even like the thing wished for and the thing gotten. Um, yeah, I mean that's definitely a part of the night and courtly love. I mean, Freud himself discusses idealization and in very complex ways. And off the top of my head, I would have to really dig to see where be something that we could discuss. It's very interesting because there is obviously something going on, and of course, Freud's notion of idealization would go into his later theories about sublimation, right? Sublimation of desire, and how sexual libidinal energy becomes social. I think that Deleuze and Guattari, they want to push back on this, but it would be interesting to juxtapose how Deleuze and Guattari refuse sublimation and juxtapose that maybe against Freud's theories of idealization. That would be something to think about. I think Deleuze and Guattari would probably be convincing, because even in like some of these more abstract notions, like a banker fondling the banknotes, or the businessman the contracts, or the judge issuing a guilty verdict, all of these for Deleuze and Guattari are like sexually charged, right? They don't need to be sublimated. And I do think that Deleuze and Guattari in A Thousand Plateaus write some really interesting lines about the chivalric knight, which we can take as a prototype of idealization. So that's where we need to pay attention to. I'm trying to remember exactly where. I feel like if I look, just so we can look out for it, because I know you and I are going to be continuing our A Thousand Plateaus discussion. Let me just see if I look up A Thousand Plateaus, and we can cut off here in just a second. Oh, here we go. So this would be in the faciality plateau, which actually you and I have read when we were first starting to get together. I think I made you read it for our discussions of machinic unconscious, right? They talk about the night and sort of the catatonia, the landscape, the face, all of this. Now, this would be interesting to see if it even doesn't necessarily directly tie into what I was thinking of, but I know that they do discuss courtly love.
I suppose that'll wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. See y'all next week.
The rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.